Welcome. Today we are going to be talking about natural selection. This video is going to go over the reading notes that you took this past week on natural selection. So we'll be talking about Darwin, influences of Darwin, and we'll also then go into the mechanism for natural selection. So let's get started. So the question then that we have to start with is what actually is the theory of evolution by natural selection? I'm sure you've heard of these terms on their own before: natural selection, evolution, and theory. But what actually is this? One thing I just want to quickly remind you of is that in science, when we use the word theory, we're actually talking about a large unifying statement that's going to explain lots of phenomenon in terms of how it happens, but also being able to use it to predict what is going to happen. So, although, and we'll focus on Darwin and even Wallace, we say, came up with this theory. At that point in time, it would not have been the theory, but it has been very widely accepted and supported from the initial finding in the 1800s. So, what is it? So this is actually then the main mechanism by which evolution is going to happen. Now, this is not the only mechanism by how evolution or a change of organisms over time actually does happen, but this is going to be that main mechanism. So we would say it's a change of organisms over time as a result of heritable traits or behaviors. So within this presentation today, I'll be going over some of those key vocabulary terms. So if we think here, we're looking at this picture. This picture, your textbook would have started with, and this is actually going to be a picture of an organism you may not think. This organism is going to be a praying mantis, but this one's going to be one version of it, unlike the ones you find around here, which are green and blend in with some of the plants in our area. This one then is going to be living on orchids. So, a question that you might want to consider as I go through the presentation today would be, how do you think the orchid mantis developed traits that make it so attractive to insects? So, if we think about organisms and those favorable adaptations that they have, how do you think that came about? And is this the most perfect form that this organism can actually have? So the praying mantis is going to be right here on the leaf of this. Now, some thoughts you might have would be maybe camouflage. Maybe it's going to be able to have a better meal based on the pollinators that are coming to this orchid flower. And all of those might be viable explanations for how it became that this orchid developed traits that are very similar to the orchid and the mantis living on them. So one of the questions I asked you to answer was this: analyze. How does information provided in Figure 5 support the idea that theories change and develop over time as new evidence is discovered? And your textbook gave you this timeline. Now, some things to note here on this timeline. It really starts in the 1700s and goes up to the mid 1800s. So we have like a 100-year span here. So as I was looking at this graph, some things that started to point out to me. One of those is that each of these is going to focus really on how organisms are related. So if I have here Linnaeus and his grouping system, he's using those phenotypes, those physical traits, to kind of group them together based upon their similarities. But as we go through this timeline, we don't just see the relationship, but it starts to add that next layer as to how organisms are actually going to be changing over time. So, as these species then are changing over time, they are dealing with a new concept. So, prior really to the 1700s, it was not challenged a lot that organisms were not just fixed and that they never changed. But starting about this point in time, you're starting to have different thinkers, different scientists voice the idea that organisms do change over time. So one of those that is pretty famous is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So in the early 1800s, he published his work on how evolution occurs. Now, what he suggested were that organisms over long periods of time either used or did not use certain body features. And what happened was if they used these body features and they would become more prominent, and they would acquire those body features throughout their lifetime. So, one example of an acquired characteristic would be, and he did not use this example, but this is one that's been used to explain his work. Let's say we have these giraffes. These giraffes, they want to reach these nutritious leaves, but they're much higher than their necks allow for them. But over time, if they keep stretching their necks, using their necks, then they get longer and they can then pass that on to their offspring. But we now know today that we do not pass on acquired characteristics. So think of like a bodybuilder, maybe it's got tattoos all over them. If they have a child, well, that child is not going to come out with large muscles and tattoos because those were traits that they acquired through their lifetime. So, what you'll see from here on out in terms of the evolution mechanism of natural selection is that it relies upon these heritable traits and not acquired traits or characteristics to be passed from parents to offspring. But Darwin and his thinking of evolution was actually influenced by many other different types of thinkers, and not all scientists. One of those, a geologist, was Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell in 1830 published a work called Principles of Geology, and within this, he went over this theory called uniformitarianism, and that just states that the events that are shaping Earth today were the events that shaped Earth a billion years ago, and that they are still going on today. So, within this, Darwin was able to realize and start to make the connection between life, biotic factors, and that non living Earth abiotic factors, and that they operated really based upon the same principles. That if the earth changed, that the organisms living on that earth could also change. The other important part about Lyell's work in geology was that he was able to establish and give some evidence that Earth is not just 6,000 years old, but that Earth is billions of years old. So he and his colleague Hutton actually both worked together, but they also established something called deep time. So if you were to think like, oh, a billion years, you wouldn't really be able to fathom that. Even today, you may have remembered doing like a scale line last year in earth science where humans, we've really been in existence for like the last second on the 24-hour clock that this planet has been around. So we've been alive for a very, 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 very small amount of time, but that the earth is so old so that these changes, including living things changing, would absolutely have time to do so. So the next year, Darwin actually went on his voyage, his famous voyage on the HMS Beagle. This voyage was to map the coastline of South America. And then in order to do so, it actually took 5 years. But he was very fortunate here where he was the ship's naturalist, so he was able to collect samples, have pleasant conversation with the captain of the ship. But he was able to really see not only this variation among organisms, but he was also able to see these actual Earth events that would shape organisms. And he was also able to access lots of different fossils from just England, where he was stationed, but he could access them from across the world and compare those characteristics, those adaptations, and the fossil records to everything else living on the planet. One of the varieties that he came into contact with was this tortoise. Now, he has lots of several examples of organisms and those traits then that he used. So those are the Galapagos tortoises. Now, there were lots of different islands in the Galapagos. It's not just one island. And those islands had different vegetation. So, depending on where he went on the different islands, he definitely noticed different traits amongst the organisms. So, if I'm looking here, this is the saddleback tortoise, and it's got the long neck, high shell to allow for that neck to extend. And here's your domed tortoise, so short neck, short legs. So the question in your book asked which one would most likely live in an environment with mosses and short plants? And that would be the doomed tortoise. And you can definitely see from the adaptations. So which ones with tall? Well, that would be the saddleback tortoise. And so why would that be the case?